Hey, how's it going, everyone? My name is Louis, and you can follow me a little bit on Twitter. So this talk is intended for indie engineer manager. So I am one of the lead developer of the Janus project. We are creating a framework to create action RPG game. So we have SIG dev, and in 3 months we make a bunch of feature. So the goal of the talk today is a very enlightening talk on touching on framework. So why do we want a framework? Here's a case study in our project. The framework that I'm working on is very focused on action RPG with a lot of cinematic, looking at The Witcher and whatnot. And the first cinematic that we made, we need 5 developers and working for 10 days to produce a very short. It's the same length duration cinematic. On the second one, though, we need only 3 devs, and it reduced to 7 days. And now, these days, we need only 2 devs and 5 days to produce one cinematic. So with the framework, it allows you to have a very, very well-oiled machine to produce what your desired result. Let's differentiate a bit between framework and engine. So when you start working on a project these days, especially when you're indie, you would definitely looking to pick an engine, right? Because you want to make content, you want to make game, and you don't really want to dive into making the engine. If you want to make the engine, you're welcome to. But usually a good engine are very generic, powerful, and flexible, so that you can extend on top of it. But usually though, a good team can work on top of the engine and extend it. So if you have to blame the engine that your team is not able to ship the game, it's not really actionable. One of the a case study would be Subnautica. They choose Unity for their engine, and the render pipeline of Unity was very lacking back in the day, so they were having a lot of issues to rendering their fleet and all of their flock of fish. So one of the engineers has to rewrite the whole rendering pipeline, and they managed to ship a very beautiful game. So the engine definitely is not the problem here. It's actually how you work with your team. So what is the limitation of the game, especially in indie scene? And it usually is the design of the game, how you design it, and your designer, and what your team wants to achieve, the final result of your game. And there are some other limitations too of game design, which is the team themselves, right? And time and money. But money will be some other issues. So a framework can actually solve. Like the gist of the talk today is to talk about the team and time, which can be summarized into your framework of your team, basically. So what is the limitation of the design itself then? Usually it's the genre. You have 2D platformer, you have 3D RPG, you have 4D puzzle, or you have any other game out there. Let's pick one of them. We'll pick 3D RPG. And let's assume that here's a component of a 3D RPG project, hypothetical, with a bunch of them. So there's a lot of steps per each of these. And here is an example workflow of creating a playable character, right? So you have the animator, the concept artist, the designer, and programmer. Assuming you have a very good indie team with four people working on something, you have some of these steps. Usually a good framework, you would definitely want to, this chart here is like an example of how you can structure your framework to work collaboratively among your team. Basically a framework is pretty much very specific to your team culture and communication, the style of how you want to collaborate with your team. For example, we go back, we have a very basic brainstorming and ideation, right, where the whole team just come together and say, hey, let's make a playable character. Hey, does they have a sword? Do they have a shield? Then, once you have the ideation, you know what you want to do, you will probably have another producer person who would make a list of everything people need to do and put it on Hack and Plan, right? Which is Hack and Plan will be a good tool for you to keep track of your task. And then your animator will start making the base model, right? Very base, using one of the base model on the market, probably. Your concept artist will start working on a silhouette and to make the character more distinct. And then your designer will start thinking about the gameplay. And yeah, the flow will move on. And the programmer rarely code, really, right? So in a lot of cases, the designer and the programmer become one person. And that's usually what happened in a indie studio. Another thing is a framework would also do a lot of automation to your pipeline, especially when you want to release your game in a very, not very tight deadline, but you want to make sure that your game can be patched after you release it, and you want to release early so you can get, not customer, but you get like the very first early players so they can test and you can tell you how suck your game is, and you can start fixing problem early on. And automate any repeatable task, like we have a bot that basically just tells us when someone have make a build and post some silly message, meme on Discord, and apparently it's pretty helpful because we can tell the playtester, hey, the meme is up, so test the game. And yeah, it's actually quite helpful. And also assisting other designer because we want to make sure that the designer be as productive as possible when they work on the game, because the main blocker of any project, right, is the vision of the designer. So a framework should make sure that it embraces the designer and make him as productive as possible by making, like, for example, one of the examples would be making, like, if you have a very heavy cinematic system, you would make a tool, right? In our project, we make a tool to allow our designer. So in Unreal Engine, we use Unreal Engine for our game, and Unreal Engine has a very, very slow, or not slow, but like very hard system to integrating cinematic into the current location, relative cinematic, because all the sequencer started world location at 000 globally. So it was pretty hard to drag and drop, like cinematic into the current location, right? So what do we do? Well, yeah, you make a tool for that, so to allow the developer, designer, to allow him to drag and drop the cinematic way what he wants, and that will allow him to be more productive in the long run. So the question now is come to how do you build a framework, and it's usually just write a lot of documentation. A framework doesn't have to be specifically strictly programming, like, because a lot of time people just do a lot of manual labor, and when you get used to it, you would do it automatically anyway. And if you are familiar with XKCD, that's the comic strip that basically outline. It's actually longer to make the program to automate the task than just do the manual task itself. So it's better to just documenting the process so that if it happened that one of your teammates has to go because they have a gig at Microsoft, for example, then you can still hire a new person and you say, hey, you will now take over that guy, and here's the documentation. Just do the task, don't even think about it. And then when it comes to more advanced tasks, then you would make tool, right? Use automation tools out there like Jenkins, Discord, Hack and Plan, right? Any tool out there that help your team work faster, build new product, and adding new features to your game faster. And then, eventually, when it comes to it, make the engine, improve the engine, make plugins for the engine, make tools to automate processes. So, which is the gist here, right? The gist is if you derive the framework early on, then your team can now focus on the game design. And a lot of time you have to cut the scope, right? Because if the scope is too big, then your team will not be able to handle it unless you have more people joining. Which the framework is actually one of the gateway to get more people to join. That's what we found with our project, because like imagine if you have a very ambitious project, but but the process of making a new character is the same all the time, right? You make a new character, you make an NPC. An NPC is not that different from the playable character, beside the controller code, which is all the programmer side. But the pipeline to make a new model, to rig him, to animate him, and to putting him into the game is the same. So it could be different animator. The thing though is when you hiring new people, especially junior, your senior person, when I have to train him, which is a lot of time, is a time sink, and that's usually how ED project die because you have more skill than you can chew, and without having that feature, your project just not good enough, and you just own the ship, and you decide to just take the gig at Microsoft and kill your project until you have more people, basically. Yeah, so with a framework, with something written down, and with tooling that allow your junior dev, really, the junior guy coming in, say, oh, okay, how do I interact with your source code? How do I put my animator into the game? You can just send him the Google Doc and say, hey, here's a Google Doc with step-by-step instruction. We actually use spreadsheet for some of that too, a spreadsheet list of every single tutorial. Especially tutorial are good. Like literally link your YouTube tutorial on how to, get a character from Blender, export him, add auto rig, and then put it into UE4. There's a tutorial there, right? That's the step. That's one step for you. And you give it to your junior person. That is like he can be very productive out right away. No need to train him. And after he's done that for like 3 times, he will probably be suitable to be a senior person too. And ED team grow pretty fast if you have documentation. So basically, this talk is all about writing documentation for your team early on. And then make tool too, but making tool is time consuming, right? So consider that as one of the tasks. But yeah, I mean, this is a very kind of I think it's a very common sense advice to write documentation. But I think not a lot of indie team do that. I think only people who do open source stuff. I'm a very huge open source enthusiast. So I really love the way that people write documentation. And you can actually observe this behavior in open source project, where people write documentation like excessively, like wiki, right? Like wiki for project, so that new contributor can jump in and be very productive with zero training. So yeah, writing documentation even for your indie project. Besides, right? I mean, documentation like game design document and project management and biz strategy. Those are the things that you need to do. But for your team, right? For your technical development and your whole process. Then yeah, write documentation for that too, because you need that for your next game as well. So that's pretty much it. The talk is all about writing documentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I totally agree with all that, by the way. I remember back at my time at Sony, we moved to a wiki-based kind of requirement strategy. And of course that meant that it was trackable, and it meant that people could actually see that and contribute and comment. And the way we did it, the framework that we created for that process was I'd capture requirements, I'd document the requirements, I'd then ask the tech team to provide a technical definition of how they were going to respond to it. And then I got to sign off whether I did it or not. And that model of being able to say, actually what we're going to get is going to be what we said, really plugs into what you're saying about having a development framework as well. Because if you have this definition of what you're going to deliver, and you have a framework of how to deliver, then you can create pipelines, and that makes everything more efficient. And then you've got live ops and games as a service all feeding off that framework. So it's an incredibly powerful way to think that, if you define the coding terms, if you define the art styles and the way that you're going to, rig things up front, you solve so many problems later. Anyway, that's my take on it. And does anyone have any questions? I'm rambling on.
Yeah, question about, how would be the framework?
Yeah,
whatever.
Anyone want to jump in? Go on, don't be shy. Okay, I will do though. Obviously I'm thinking about things like, the kind of coding Bible, how do you frame things? Because I like to know that any code can come in and understand what's a variable, what's a format of that, and all this other stuff. But I also think, like say what is the scale that you're going to create an avatar or a object,
Yes,
and how you're going to rig it, and all those principles.
Yep.
How do you make that first decision about what that's going to be and deal with problems as they come later when you need to think about change?
A lot of stuff. So, for example, especially code convention and asset preference or asset styling, right? And asset, all of the asset, the way that we want the asset to be produced, all of that. There are so many blogs out there, resources out there. There are so many people who have blog about their process, and people who have put on GitHub their own code convention, especially with using Unreal Engine. Unreal Engine has their Wikipedia where they have all of that code convention, right? So adopting the standard is definitely the best, so that there's no confusion. And then we will change it, we'll adopt it. We will adopt our own style as we move on, because we have to grow outside of that too, right? But generally adopting like the business standard, or the industry standard. And
there is one?
Huh?
Isn't there about 5?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of them, right? So that's why you have to choose one.
Choose one, yeah.
Yeah, just pick one and stick to it. Like, even if it's the worst one, but your senior person has already picked it, just stick to it, right? You don't want a junior person coming in and say, hey, I want to add ES6 to your web project. And you'll be like, well, we need to ship it first, And once we ship it, we will work on the next one, the next project, and then we will use React ES6. So stay with that, right? Stay with what has been there to ship your game first, because the goal is to ship game and move on to the next project, and don't limit yourself to one single project, because it's not worth it.
So one question that comes to mind with that is, you inevitably down the line have something which has to, you find an issue, a problem, you have to change it, and that can have a profound effect on some of the decisions you made earlier. How do you make sure that the changes you need to implement get built back into the framework? Because one of the issues I've seen is people have a lovely framework, go along, and then they have this problem, and then they just fix it and get on with it from that point onwards, and they forget.
So the first thing that we would do is triage and see if the problem is actually a problem, see if it worth solving, and see how many times it has occurred. Because to have something to be encoded into the framework, it's usually a recurrent problem. Especially with the reason why we make the bot to tell everyone, to tell the playtester that, hey, there's new build happening, is because one of the person has to build the thing and then have to watch the bot, right? And then when the bot is done at 5 a.m., then he has to go to the channel and ping everyone and say, hey, playtester, here's a new build. It happened every week, right? So because of that, it happens so often that we say, okay, let's make a bot and automate the process. And and then all the other problem, right? That when there's a problem with for example, a person, one of our animator forgot to add one of the shin bone in one of the rig, for example. That happened a lot. And because we know he's a very junior dev. We know that if we add new junior dev, they will probably make the same mistake. So just add that, a single line in a doc, and highlight it and say, hey, add the shin bone.
I think you can tie that into kind of automated tests as well to a certain extent, can't you? Making sure that you've got this roadmap of not just what you do and here's the order of how to do it, but actually here are some things we found out. And then as we do unit testing of those things, we can run a first pass automatically. So it can make the whole process a lot more efficient, particularly when you're 3 months into live and you've got to do a new update and you've got to have a new event and you've got to keep having enough content for those things.
Yep.
If you haven't set it up in the first place, you're going to be scrabbling. Is that fair?
Yes.